So here we are with chapter 9. Now remember, your next exam, the third one, covers chapters 7, 8, and 9. So we're going to wrap up chapter 9 right here. And I'm going to leave out a lot of extra stuff that I would do maybe if we were in class at a normal semester for the interest of time. And then your final exam does not cover everything, as my little checklist for you said. It only covers chapter 10. And then if I say anything out of chapter 11, which I think is pretty cool that we made it this far, considering, whatever's going on in the world. So anyway, we're still in the Middle Ages, y'all. Chapter 9, the late Middle Ages. So we're about to get out of them. 1100 to 1300. So the second slide here is literally just a map of 1378, which is probably, I think it was the clearest map that I could find that was closest to this time period. But anyway, it just kind of shows you where things are. It shows you over there we still have Castile and Aragon and Navarre. We don't have the Iberian Peninsula turned into Spain yet, and other things that are going to eventually happen there. You can see, of course, Italy has not been unified for several hundred years, not till 1866, or I mean, to be technical, 1871. And you also don't have a unified Germany. You have all these different states, Bavaria, Austria, Bohemia, Brandenburg, and all of that. So you can just kind of get an idea of what the map looks like somewhere around that time. Okay, guess what we're going to talk about for a little while? We're going to talk about medieval towns. Okay, now remember, during feudalism, the towns got smaller for a while. You're going to see trade go away in a lot of places for quite a while, particularly the Dark Ages from about 500 to 1000 AD. And we're going to see that the towns are going to start coming back again. Remember, about the 12th century. And trade is going to come back, which is going to push the towns to grow and all of that. So we're going to talk about the towns just a little bit here. One thing to notice is that many of these towns and ones that grew into big cities had started out at some point in time in the Middle Ages earlier as a fortress, a place of protection, right? And you can see the concentric, notice the design, the circular design as it grows outward. And if you look carefully, you can see that they're going to be, as the town grows a little bit, they're going to move the walls out a little bit further, move the walls out a little bit further. And eventually, we're going to get to the times where we don't have to have walls around our towns for protection. Now, in the medieval towns, there's going to be a few things that you will find. Okay, so if you were to go to the market square in a medieval town around this period of time, once towns are growing back again, you're going to find, a market square, a place that kind of makes me think of, but it's not exactly like that, makes me think of the Agora with the Greeks, or makes me think of, a county seat here in these little towns in Kentucky where you have the square, right? Kind of, they remind me of those places. But on the market square, you're going to have places for people to sell their goods. You're going to eventually have stores. We're going to have stores popping up by the 1100s, by the 12th century. We're going to have stores, remember, as merchants start to settle down. And instead of traveling with their wares all over the place, from one town or even country or whatever to another, they're going to learn that they can settle down and people will come to them if they have, good quality items and all of that. So you're going to have a market square, and usually around the market square, you're going to see some stores. And you're also going to see in the middle of the market square around, I don't remember exactly when this started, but you're going to have a big clock. Okay, you're going to have the town clock. And see, this is way back before you're going to need to know that it is 10:43 p.m. or 11:59 a.m. or it's way before that. You're not in a situation back then where you have to be somewhere at a precise moment because everybody isn't going to be able to exactly tell the precise moment, right? I mean, even up until a few years ago, out at the college in the building that we were in, the JSO building, one of the first things I would tell the students the very first day of my classes, I would say, look, every clock in this building is slightly different. So please synchronize your watch or your whatever, I guess it was watches mostly then, with my clock here in this room for this class because they're all just a little bit different. So see, I mean, you couldn't tell people I'm going to meet you for lunch at 2 p.m. or something. So they had a clock though that was as reliable as a clock could get. And you know what's going to make things change is eventually going to be the Industrial Revolution, where you have to see people, where you see people having to move into towns, move into the cities, and get jobs eventually in factories. And that's going to require them to be paid wages by the hour, which is going to require them to have to be there at a certain time for a certain number of hours and all that kind of stuff, right? So Market Square, in the Market Square, you've got a town clock, you've got some shops there, and you've also got the town cross. It's going to be a big cross that is actually going to be, they say, there to remind evildoers that no matter what they think, God is always watching them. And in that same vein, when we're talking about the Market Square, you're going to have also a great church and a town hall, those type of things. So you're going to see that each trade might have its own separate street, like Shoe Lane or Leather Lane or something like that. And most people can't read, so that's going to be where they're not going to have words most of the time up there. They're going to have symbols. People are not widely literate. And it was a pretty dirty dirty life living in those towns in the Middle Ages as they were coming back. And one thing that happened with the towns was the towns loosened the hold on serfs. Okay, serfs, the unfree workers that were bound to the land of a manor, and they had a lord above them, a lord of the manor, and they would work for that lord. They were peasants basically, and they were sort of like slaves, but they did have some rights. Okay, so one of the things was they were not allowed to leave their land, and they were not allowed, or they were not, their lord was not allowed to sell them away from their land. So when the town started coming back and growing, then you're going to see a lot of these serfs taking off to have their own lives. And according to the customs of the medieval times, a lord could not claim a serf who had escaped if the serf had lived in a town or a city for a year and a day. Then they were free. That was one way they could become free. So again, a lot of stuff going on here. I mean, the whole idea here, the guy that makes the town is the merchant. Remember, the merchant, the one who's selling things. And you're going to have the inhabitants of these towns, often called burghers, or it becomes bourgeoisie, but burg as in Burghers, inhabitants of the burg, citizens of the burg, the town. So anyway, the towns are going to be built really in a societal manner by the merchants, which represent a brand new class that is not tied directly to the land. Remember that. So the medieval Market Street, I think I've already described it pretty much as far as I don't know, as maybe we want to go. I mean, you're going to have these market streets. They're going to be really notorious for the crowded conditions, and the people who are merchants are usually going to live in their shops that they have set up, and it's going to be uncomfortable. These towns, I mean, by our standards especially, and apparently every town had its own smell. Okay, they said that you could tell if you were coming within however many miles of, say, London or York or wherever. You could tell by the smell as much as anything else. And look at that picture that I have chosen for that slide, and you can see again just the crowded nature of everything. You also see that the merchants or the artisans, craftsmen, or whoever, that they are actually doing their work at the front of their shop. That way people passing by can see what they've got to offer, and just kind of watch how their craftsmanship is. And usually these stores were pretty narrow, but then they were also pretty deep a lot of times. So there on slide number 6, you can see just kind of, yeah, the I guess atmosphere of one of those towns, and you can see where I've mentioned where they don't have a lot of writing up there. You have scissors over there for the barber, and you have other stuff. You also have a guy driving a pig right through the middle of town. You also hear my dog. Hang on, I'm gonna have to. Well, that's basically all I wanted to say about that one. So you can just look at the picture, and again, it's showing you the. Wait a minute, puppy. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. She's not going to listen. But that picture is not all that important. It's just to show you the ambiance of the town. We're going to talk about the Hanseatic League, also known as the Hansa. And here's just a picture that you can refer back to, showing the ports and some of the major cities of the Hanseatic League. Yet another map. Maps are really important in history, and we used to have maps that you could pull down, and at some point, I think in the classroom, and I think at some point the maps started falling down and hitting people, or I don't know what happened, but sometimes it's clunky to go back and forth when you're doing a lecture and then stop and show a map. But in that case, this is a pretty good format for that, because here's a map showing the Hanseatic League. Just look up at the legend up there where it says the chief cities, the member cities, the trading posts, and the foreign cities granted privileges. But you can see, if you look where the Hanseatic League began, it was with the two cities of Hamburg and Lübeck, which are on either side of the Danish peninsula. Okay, Hamburg and Lübeck. Now, Hamburg had access to the herring spawning grounds. Okay, so they had access to a lot of fish. And in a match made in heaven, right, Lübeck had access to a lot of salt. So they decided to kind of band together, because if you're trying to transport fish, right, trying to trade and export fish somewhere to another city or place, it's not going to last very long. It's going to start to smell, and it's going to go bad. And what's one way you can preserve, say, fish, country ham or something like that? Well, that would be salt. So they team up, and that's where we have the very beginnings of the Hansa. Okay, now you notice on this map, you see down there you have the Holy Roman Empire, and remember that came about. If we want to look at it, the way that if we started with Charlemagne in 800, on December 25th, the year 800 AD, and the Pope crowned him and so on, and remember how important the coronation of Charlemagne was. Okay, it's going to go about from about 800 to about 1804, 5, 6, whenever it was that Napoleon actually dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. So remember, it's not the same as the Roman Empire. This is a whole new thing that came about with came about with Charlemagne at the beginning generally. Okay. Now you notice there's a lot of those cities in there that are member cities. Now Hansa is going to grow much bigger as time goes on. So let's talk a little bit more about what the Hansa actually is. So since we're not in person and everything, I try to make things really clear on here as much as I can. You know, I put some stuff on PowerPoints and a couple of times, you know, I've added things that wouldn't necessarily be on there if we were in person talking about it. But don't forget to take notes on some of these things because sometimes that will really help you, I promise. Okay? Just like you were in class. Now, the Hanseatic League is going to start out between Hamburg and Lübeck, and then it becomes this trade association, economic association, okay, of the merchants, the traders, okay, located in all these different cities. And the Germans are going to be very important. Germans are going to be dominant in there. Of course, notice the two founding cities, and then notice the cluster of all the member cities, whatever time, whatever particular year that map is referencing. And again, they're going to grow a lot larger. You're going to have, if I'm not mistaken, over 100, maybe even 150 members or foreign cities that were granted trade privileges with the Hansa. At some point, you're going to have at least 100 and more of these guys that have banded together. Now, the purpose is, okay, they're going to exert their interest over any competitor. So if you join the Hanseatic League, you're going to be working together to keep good prices. Okay, you're going to want good prices for yourself, and it's going to protect your trading from not only economic issues that might arise as you all work together, but it's going to protect the trading and shipping from pirates. Okay, so the Hanseatic League is going to be dominant in the Baltic Sea and the north flowing rivers. Hanseatic League actually was meeting, they would meet, send representatives and so on, up until sometime in the 1600s, I believe. And, they never dissolved the Hanseatic League. Just a piece of trivia. It still exists. I mean, it doesn't meet or anything, but they never dissolved it. So technically it's still a thing. So every now and then, sometimes you might hear someone call Bremen or Hamburg or somewhere, you might hear them call it a Hanseatic city or something like that, some reference to the Hansa. So that's the big important stuff you need to know about that. Oh, Gothic architecture. Oh, Gothic architecture is something else. Okay, Gothic architecture is a thing all its own in so many ways. And it's going to start back in the 1100s or so in France. And it's going to come about from, just some arches that came from the Moors over in Spain, and then other things that they're going to borrow and some things that they're going to create. So Gothic style is of the late medieval period, right? And it's going to have all these things like the pointed arches, things like rib vault. We're going to talk about flying buttresses, big windows. We're going to have lots of stained glass windows and all these other things, right? You don't have to know everything there. You have to have some, pick out the main important things and also use your notes when you're taking a test, although you can't look everything up, hopefully. But anyway, no, definitely what we talk about a little bit more detail. So this was just kind of an overview where you can see the um, the basics of Gothic style, and it's very, it's very, I call it severe. Okay, there's a lot of severity to it. It's beautiful and elegant in some ways, but to me, it's also sometimes a little bit scary, as we'll talk about in just a minute. as I said, Gothic architecture is going to start sometime in the 12th century, the 1100s AD, and it's going to start in France, and they are going to have some inspiration from the Moors. And you're also going to have, and that accounts for the pointed arches, also some of the Romanesque and so on. Now, again, mentioning again some of the things, those pointed arches, the flying buttresses, those are two things I want you to know. The elaborate sculptures, things like gargoyles and all sorts of other things, they're going to fill so much space with these sculptures. It's going to be, to me, I don't know, it kind of feels a little overdone sometimes, but in some ways, as I said, it's beautiful in its own way. Now, it used to be called French style architecture, but in the Renaissance, as what happened in the Renaissance, things tended to fall out of fashion and they got a little bit, got a little bit haughty sometimes in the Renaissance. They're like, oh, look at that. Look at what they've done. And they thought it was crude and not nearly as, you know, not nearly as sophisticated as the French should have been. So they didn't want to label it French style anymore. So they called it Gothic. Now, why would they call it Gothic? Well, remember, the Goths, we had the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, and we talked about them. But the Goths were barbarians, right? They were barbarians to the Romans. And in the Renaissance, we're going back and rediscovering the Roman things again, and the Greek, the classical stuff. So they're going to start calling it Gothic to insult it, really, which again, in some ways, I really love Gothic architecture, and in some other ways, I don't necessarily. It all depends. It all depends. Now, some examples are Notre Dame in Paris and St. Patrick's in Dublin. Also, the one we're going to talk about a little bit is Chartres Cathedral, which is a little ways outside of Paris. That's the one we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. And again, more info and stuff about Gothic architecture in general. Well, I'll tell you, first of all, one of the big things about Gothic architecture, and we studied about it for quite a while in one of my graduate classes at some point in humanities, and the Gothic cathedrals in particular, the idea was to open up the churches for more light, the cathedrals for more light, to make it more of a spiritual experience, more of a beautiful experience for the people that come in. Now, you couldn't just build a cathedral anywhere. Okay, the cathedrals, getting a cathedral was a big process, and it was very important for the towns and cities that got a nice cathedral. And it took forever sometimes to build these cathedrals. So you see that the visual arts are really important. The role of light, we're going to see. Scholasticism, you've got some translation of events. You've got stories that are from the Bible that are actually depicted in many of the pictures in the stained glass. And some of them were so incredibly complex that there were people there like tour guides ish. Okay, someone who would guide you around and explain them to you. If you were just a regular person, you might not understand a lot of the stained glass. So anyway, as I was saying, you can't just build one of these churches, one of these great cathedrals at that time. I mean, building a cathedral was tied up in all kinds of just, well, one of the things was they wanted it to be somewhere that was sort of centrally located for several of the manors, or some of the people. They wanted it to be somewhere in an area where more people would be able to make pilgrimages there, right? So that was important. And cathedral, if you know any Latin, which I know enough to be dangerous as usual, but cathedral comes from the Latin word cathedra, which just means bishop's seat, right? So the church is going to be right in the middle of whichever town is chosen. And again, people would, that was a something that was very important. If you got a cathedral built in your town, that was an amazing thing. And you're going to see that sometimes it takes so long to build them. For example, I was trying to think about some of the ones that took incredibly long times, and some of them took over 300 years to build. Some of them you're going to find they say that they've never been finished, that they're always going to continue to be works in progress or whatever. But anyway, some of them, I mean, it's going to take generations. I remember we saw a video about that in that same class I was talking about, where we studied Gothic architecture, and it showed, you know, how many priests it went through, and the people and the generations, and it became a matter of the men and women who were part of this, and particularly the ones who were literally building it. They were so proud of their part in creating something, and they built them to last. I mean, they built them to last. So, and they have, and that's, you know, the typical of your Gothic cathedrals from the Middle Ages. Now, part of the Gothic architecture as well that I've always thought was interesting is most of the large Gothic churches, and even some of the smaller ones, are built in what's called a cruciform plan, okay, or a shape like a cross. And so they're going to have this long nave, which, you know, is going to be leading you down to an area that is called the choir, okay, or maybe they have other names for that. But the choir, as in, you know, what we call, say, if you're singing or whatever. But it's going to be that's going to be a part that's between the nave, the big, you know, entry part, and the actual sanctuary. Okay, the sanctuary is going to be down further in the, you know, in the sort of the top part of the cross, so to speak. So anyway, there's all kinds of things you could dig into. You know, like I said, we spent quite a while studying about the Gothic architecture, and it's really so fascinating in many ways. You also have a book. It's a novel, and I actually think there's a part two. But one of my students gave it to me one time, and I know it was made into a movie, but please read books. I beg you, please read books. But there's a book called Pillars of the Earth, and it tells of the story of a town that is having a cathedral built there. So anyway, that became a really well-known book, and again, apparently a miniseries or a movie or something as well. But my professor recommended that to us, and I'm recommending it to you if you get a chance. Of course, some of this is repetitious, but repetition never really hurts anyone. But again, airy and bright. They want them, when, you know, when you go in, they want it to be really airy, bright, lots of stained glass windows, ornaments, and so on. The pointed arches, and all that. And you notice that it does focus a lot on verticality. It's reaching toward the sky. You have the spires and those type of things, and the towers. That's all part of Gothic architecture. And to me, again, you know, looking at the front, say, some of the time I look at them and I say, wow, you know, it looks kind of, you know, kind of maybe not all that inviting. It's beautiful, but it still looks to me, maybe just my taste, as I said, but some of these cathedrals, although they're beautiful, and I would love to go visit many of them because of their beauty, but they do look very, I can't come up with another word other than severe, right? They're so I don't know, besides the verticality, there's not a lot of of give in this, right? Everything seems to be very structured in such a way, and it is in such a way that it doesn't have a lot to me of of flow and the airiness that they're talking about. Although when you get inside, from what I've seen, you do actually see what they were talking about when they wanted you to have the experience of, like heaven-ish experience, as close as they could provide for the people. Great picture here on slide 14. And this is just a couple of, well, a couple pictures, side by side. But the entire sanctuary is thus pervaded by a wonderful and continuous light entering through the most sacred windows. Okay, so that's a goal, and you can see that it works. I mean, you've got all that beautiful light coming through, and you're also going to see on some of the stained glass windows the effect that that's going to have too. We have to take a minute and talk about the flying buttress, which has a funny name, but it's very important. Now, the purpose of the flying buttress is to prevent the outward collapse of the arches. Okay, we're using the severe arches. So we need something that's going to some of the take some of the pressure off, and it's also going to allow you to open up other areas inside these cathedrals. So they're using something that at the time was revolutionary called a flying buttress. Now, this is basically, you can see an example of several of these right here. They're freestanding brick or stone supports attached to the exterior walls, either by an arch or a half arch. I like this picture of the flying buttresses there. You can see also the ornate, just the sculptures that are everywhere. A lot of them are going to be of the saints and the apostles and so on. You have over on the left, you have, of course, the drawing of the way it looks. And then you have the ones in real life and how they look. But again, this is taking pressure off inside where you're going to have the support coming a lot of times in this particular kind of architecture from the outside. And it's an incredible thing. You imagine the time that someone creates something that we call revolutionary for their time. Again, this is one of those things that it was like, wow, why didn't we think of this before? But it worked beautifully. So I've mentioned the stained glass windows quite a few times. And again, since the walls are no longer going to be the primary supports here, then, because you got the flying buttresses on the outside, then you've got the Gothic buildings, including large areas of glass. Now remember, as medieval times were coming to an end, as we had the Viking and Magyar invasions ending and all of that, you're going to start to see people, when trade comes back and the towns start to grow again, you're going to see people start using glass every now and then in their homes. It depends on your status and if you could afford it, but also your safety. Because when you were having all those invasions, you really didn't want glass. You didn't want a whole lot of glass in your home because it would be easier to break. You certainly aren't going to put it in something like a beautiful cathedral. So anyway, that's a sign too that, a little bit more peaceful things are going on here. And these stained glass windows are sometimes enormous. Now, if you have those and within those you have some smaller windows, as you can see here, put them all together, and again, you have this effect of light, beautiful, airy, within the cathedral. Now, this one is actually from from Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, and I don't even try to speak French. I don't. I try not to try. I try not to try. I try not to do any accents on pretty much anything. But Notre Dame just means Our Lady, which is a reference, of course, to to the Virgin Mary, the Holy Mother. And so Notre Dame, there's more than one. Okay, this is the Notre Dame that we're looking at there that people think of, the one in Paris. And we're going to see again when we talk about when we talk about Chartres, that if you look at it a little bit more closely, if you look into the Chartres Cathedral, it's actually Our Lady of Chartres, okay, instead of Our Lady of Paris. So anyway, just little tidbits of information there. But anyway, I love this. And if you look at those are stories probably of some of the apostles and so on that would be interpreted by, like I mentioned, those tour guides. But also look down at the very, kind of the bottom right, and you see again, every space is filled with something ornate, beautiful, sculpture. Imagine the talent and the workmanship that would have gone into creating these things. And again, they made them to last. We're going to talk about Chartres Cathedral a little bit because that's the one that we spent quite a bit of time on in the class that I took at some point. But Chartres is, as I said, it's Our Lady of Chartres. Chartres is outside of Paris. It's somewhere south of Paris, I believe. So this cathedral, I think it was built relatively quickly for a cathedral, if I'm not mistaken. But let's talk about it for just a moment. My professor who taught that class had been to this cathedral, and she told us about the labyrinth. She told us about the experience of being able to walk through the labyrinth while she was there. The thing about it is, labyrinths like this were in a lot of Gothic cathedrals. They were something that were put in there in the earlier times when they were first building them. And some of them are going to be removed, but they're going to symbolize something. Now, I remember my professor talked to us about what an amazing thing it is to get to walk through this labyrinth. And the symbolization, there's all sort of, or symbolism rather. The symbolism, you can go really deep into it, and we don't need to go and get all, so deep into it. But just to put it in a really simple term, it's symbolizing the path of man towards salvation through, God, through Jesus in the Catholic Church. So there's only a single path that you can follow. And certain days you're able to go in and you're able to walk the path of this labyrinth. Okay. So that's a pretty cool thing. And that was one thing that my professor took back, was how beautiful it was, and especially when it was lit at night sometimes, which I'll show you on the next slide. So there's a beautiful picture, I think, of the labyrinth at night, being lit up at that moment. And I forgot how big it is. I want to say it's got I don't know, 40 something foot circumference. I don't know, but it's pretty massive, as you can see. And you look back in the back of that picture and you can see people sitting there. You see people actually just sitting there. So you can see how small the people are in relation to the labyrinth there as well. That chapter kind of goes all over the place, and so do we, because we're trying to tell you the chapter, basically the important things. And we cut now over to the story of Abelard and Heloise, which is sometimes portrayed by people as this kind of grown-up Romeo and Juliet-ish type story without the death, but a sad story, tragedy nonetheless. Well, I don't know. I'll leave it to you to decide what you think of Abelard and Heloise. Okay, so in the 12th century in Paris, we have a girl named Heloise, and she happens to be the niece of Notre Dame's canon, okay, guy in charge here at Fulbert, and she wanted an education. Now it's medieval times, and women are not going to be going to college. Now, again, remember that many of the universities, the big centers of learning, are going to start from the cathedral schools. Okay, so anyway, the girls are not going to be sent to the cathedral schools, the universities, and so on. But if you have a father, or if you have a man who, I guess, is your guardian or whatever, because she is indeed living with her uncle Fulbert. If you had a guy who wanted you to get an education because he believed that you really were smart enough and deserved it or whatever, then that might happen. Well, it happened with Heloise. So Peter Abelard, he was kind of a character. He was a professor over at one of the universities, and he left. He went to another one of the big ones. There were a lot of the early universities that started in Paris, but Peter Abelard kind of had a great following of students. Students would come from far and wide just to listen to him lecture, listen to him talk. But also, Abelard was a bit cantankerous. I mean, the establishment, no, wait, that's not the right word. The administration, I guess, of the colleges, universities, they didn't necessarily like him. He didn't necessarily like authority. So anyway, he ends up being hired as tutor for Heloise. So Abelard, who was, like I said, I mean, he was this incredibly well-loved professor by a lot of the students. He's incredibly well known. He had a great reputation for teaching. So he moving in with Fulbert, the canon, Heloise's uncle, and the family, and he starts tutoring her, and they fall in love and whatever. Now, she was very smart, obviously. She knew so many things about history and languages and so on. But yeah, he seems to be a little bit arrogant. He wanted to continue to rise up in the church, his career. He wanted to have a career in the church. And if he, if he married someone, he would find that several doors were closed to him immediately. So what happens is her uncle finds out that they've been having this relationship, and her uncle separates them and whatever, and they try to meet whenever they can, just in secret, as people will do, especially when you try to keep them apart. But anyway, she ends up pregnant at some point, and at the time when she becomes pregnant, he is going to send her off to live with some of his family. Now, I think the problem was, what's going to happen here is that Abelard wants a secret marriage. Okay, that was to, really to appease, I guess, uncle. And he didn't want anyone to know because, well, he wanted to continue rising up in the church. So eventually they got married, and then Fulbert told everyone about the marriage. Now, this was bad for Abelard, so it turns out that Heloise said, "Oh, no, 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 that's a lie. We never got married." Well, okay. Turns out then that Abelard told her that she needed to go to a convent, and he said that would protect her from her uncle's wrath, because, she's actually got a child at this time. Now, the funny thing about the child is it's a boy, and he's named Astrolabe, Astrolabe, and it's a piece of technology from their time, and it had something to do with navigation and astronomy. Now, it is said that they named the baby this name, after this, this piece of technology. Said that they were making a point that you could be of the world in some ways, but also still be loyal to the church. This is interesting. Now, when he sent her away to the convent, she was living with the nuns, but she was not a nun, okay? She's not going to be a nun at this time. So Fulbert can't figure out exactly what's going on, but he thought that, Abelard was sending her away because he wanted to be rid of her and continue on with his career and all of the other stuff that we mentioned. So slide 22, some of this I've already said, but the whole secret marriage, and then they got married, and then all this stuff. And Abelard sends her off to a convent, which it means she's going to be living with nuns. And what happens then, again, I'm just like, wow, this could have been avoided. But her uncle Fulbert probably thought that he wanted to be rid of her and so on by forcing her into this religious community, cloistered, where they're not out and about and whatever. But we end up with the castration of Abelard. Now, Abelard's going to write a book that's basically kind of titled "The Story of My Misfortunes" or something like that. And he tells that the way that he told the story was a little bit different, because we're not sure if Fulbert was participating in the castration, or if Fulbert hired some thugs to castrate Abelard. We're not sure. But Abelard, the way he told it, was that they pinned him down and, quote, cut off the part of my body that had so offended them, end quote, which seems like a pretty fair way to put that, I guess. So anyway, he decides to become a monk. He takes the vows, and he said that Heloise needs to become a nun as well. So the problem is, she wasn't called to be a member of the religious, right? That's going to be like a sister who is someone who's going to be more out in the community, or a nun who's going to be cloistered. And basically, I believe their job for the main part of a nun's job, I believe, from what my understanding is prayer. So she wasn't really called to become a nun, or that's what she said. Well, it didn't really make much difference to Abelard. Both of them are going to have taken vows into the religious life. So, what happened to the child? Well, my understanding is that Astrolabe was raised by her uncle Fulbert and I guess her aunt, I guess his family. So, Abelard and Heloise are going to exchange letters for all these years, many years. And again, sometimes presented as a great tragic love story. I see a few times along the way that things could have been a little bit different. But anyway, if you dig into Abelard and Heloise a little bit deeper, you'll find there's also a lot of other unanswered questions about the relationship. And if you read the letters, I mean, that's one way to dig into it if you're interested in history and that type of thing. If you could read the letters of Abelard and Heloise, there's a lot of subtleties in there about their relationship that a lot of scholars have tried to figure out over the years. And so anyway, there's some unknowns there. But yeah, again, he ends up at some point leaving the monastery. I think he had gone and maybe created sort of his own monastery almost at one point, I think, but he ends up leaving, and he goes out and kind of builds his own little shack of some sort. And it turns out that his reputation is so great still, as a wonderful teacher that students, potential students, come and actually build, I guess, shelters around him. They'll come, and they'll build their own place, their own little shack, or maybe, I don't know, maybe some of them did lean-tos, I don't know. But anyway, he starts to teach again. So there's all kinds of stuff going on there. I like that story because it's, again, it does have a lot of facets to it. So what about his relationship with Bernard of Clairvaux, Saint Bernard? Well, Saint Bernard was a monk and a mystic, and he was an opponent of Peter Abelard. And the reason for that is he accused Abelard of attacking the faith. Now, here's the thing. They did have some commonality. Both Bernard of Clairvaux and Peter Abelard believed that theology was, faith seeking understanding. The question was how, right? How do you get that faith and understanding, and where's it coming from, right? So Bernard of Clairvaux emphasized the faith or theology of the heart. Okay, so faith was most important to him in seeking understanding. And Abelard stressed the understanding part, or the theology of reason. Now, Bernard of Clairvaux basically said that Abelard was using logic to try to support things that were based on faith, which was therefore illogical. Now, a lot of things happen that we don't have to go into, but it turns out that at some point, Abelard is going to end up being excommunicated from the church, and then he's let back into the church, and it's a whole thing. But you just need to know that there was a lot of stress between those two men. Okay, so Dante Alighieri, the great Italian poet, author of La Commedia in Italian, and just the comedy, we could translate it. And then the church at some point is going to add in divine to it, which means godly, right? So the story of the Divine Comedy, one thing you need to know first is the traditional, say, like the Greeks and so on, the traditional classical definition of comedy versus tragedy had to do with the ending. I mentioned this to you before at some point, but the ending, as long as it has a good ending, I think I even mentioned Dante in this context to you before for some reason. It may have had something to do with Virgil, the Roman poet. But anyway, comedy means it has a good ending. Tragedy means it has a bad ending, a sad ending. Okay? So anyway, this is not a funny story. That's not what they mean by that. Although there is some humor in it, but it is going to have a good ending. So the story here, the story's great. I read that in a graduate class, and we read the whole thing, and we really tore it apart and explained some of the obscure references, and I learned so much when reading that book in a class that I would have never been able to have done when it was, if I'd done it by myself. But anyway, it describes the comedy, or the Divine Comedy by Dante, describes a journey by the narrator through the afterworld. We have Purgatorio, Inferno, and Paradiso, which is purgatory, inferno, hell, and then Paradiso, heaven. Okay, so that's what we're going to see. We're going to encounter Dante, the narrator, in these places. If you ever get a chance to read Dante, the comedy, in a classroom setting in particular, I would highly recommend it. It's really a great study, is what it is. But Dante is going to be the narrator, or at least his character's name is Dante. And he says at the very beginning, I don't have a copy of the book. Sometimes I bring it into the classroom and read the beginning part to the students, because he says something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing it, and he says, like, when I was in the middle of our life, or in the middle of our life, I found myself in a dark wood and I could not find the light. Okay, and there's a ton of stuff in there, you know. When in the middle of our life, or something like that, our life. What he's saying is he's about 35 years old, because biblically, 70 years old is about what man is given, according to the Bible in some parts, or I can't remember where it is, but anyway, he's referencing he's about 35, and he finds himself off the path of light. He's gone the wrong way. He's given into some vices and so on. And so he sees the light over there, way far away, and he heads toward it, but he's stopped by all these different animals that are terrifying. And each animal is going to represent one of his, what he believes to be one of his sins. Okay, so you might have, I don't know, there's a panther that's going to represent something that Dante believes was one of his sins, or, there's different animals, a lion, I believe, and so on. I can't remember, because again, I can't remember all of that, but that's the gist of how it begins. And then he's trying to find his way out of the dark wood, and he comes upon, of all people stepping into the wood with him, the Roman poet Virgil, the guy who wrote, I'm pausing so you can say it out loud to yourself, because you should know this, wrote the Aeneid. Remember the story of Aeneas and his journey from the burning Troy over to the plains of Latium over in Italy, and all that, right? So anyway, the Roman poet Virgil. Now, Virgil can't enter heaven because he was a pagan. He was living in the time before Christ. So that puts him in, actually in hell. Well, Virgil, as well as I think Homer, and I forgot who else, some other of the great classical men, were down there. I believe they were living in maybe the first circle of hell, kind of like in limbo or whatever. But it may have been the next, like, circle of hell. I really think it was the first circle, because I remember reading about them, and they were all sort of living there together in a kind of a house or something. But the way it was explained, it was talking about how Virgil was coming out to be a guide for Dante. Now, Dante, though, when he sees Virgil, I mean, that's his, as we would say, idol. That's the poet that he looks up to. And he calls Virgil the light and glory of all poets, my teacher, my lord, and law, which I think is a little hyperbolic, but okay. Hang on, I've got a barking dog again. Sorry. Anyway, Virgil becomes his guide through hell and purgatory, but he can't go into heaven, as I said, because he was a pagan. So Virgil becomes his teacher while he explains what's happening and the theological meanings and so on, the symbolism that Dante is observing. So Dante will be led into heaven by his second guide, who will be Beatrice. Now, first, let me tell you that when Virgil and Dante are going through purgatory, the sinners in purgatory were being punished, but the difference was they were doing their penance willingly and almost happily, because they knew at the end of purgatory there would be heaven. And when he went to hell, this is where all the sinners were who would never repent. And so they were all angry, and they were having the same punishments and so on. But they were furious at God, and furious, they would never, excuse me, they would never repent. And so this was the best it was ever going to get for them. And he goes into a lot of details when it comes to hell, somewhat purgatory, but also hell. And anyway, let's go ahead and talk about Beatrice for just 1 second here. Beatrice, she is his unrequited love. He fell in love with her supposedly when he was a little boy, and they never got married. She married someone else. She died, I believe, in childbirth at age 24, and he's always writing a lot of things to her after her death. He continues to write about her the rest of his life, pretty much. And he puts her in the highest possible place in his story. She represents someone so pure that she can take him into heaven and into the sight of God, because God cannot stand to be in the presence of sin, right? So that's why the purge, in purgatory is going to have to happen before you go to heaven. And Beatrice is seen by Dante as pure perfection. And then here's a quote. It says, "And all of a sudden me seemed that day was added unto day, as though he who hath the power had adorned heaven with a second sun. Beatrice was standing with her eyes all fixed upon the eternal wheels, and I fixed my sight, removed from there above on her." So I have to say, having read the comedy, Inferno was the most interesting in that weird sort of way that things like that are interesting. And the circles of hell where he puts people, that's really important, because each circle is going to have certain types of sinners that are going to be in there. And then the farther down you go, the closer you're getting to Satan, who ironically is in a block of ice. If we were in person, we sometimes have a more spirited conversation about I have the drawing up here. This is one of, many, but this is the one that I kind of like. It's really simple to follow, but we sometimes have spirited discussions about it. But anyway, you have up at the top, there's Dante and Virgil, and then, there's the vestibule of hell. And Dante also famously puts one of the popes in the, I guess in the vestibule of hell, or maybe in the first circle. It's actually the Pope who was alive at the time of Dante. But anyway, if you go down through there and you look at the circles of hell, you're going to see things like unbaptized children, pre-Christ, honorable men, and so on, which actually is limbo, first circle of hell. Second circle, now this is where it got interesting for me, because the first, what he calls shades, these are the spirits, right, of the dead. First shades that he encounters shows you the concept of contrapasso, Contrapasso. This is Italian for, pretty much the punishment fits the crime. So you're gonna find in that second layer of hell, or second circle of hell, you're gonna find Francesco and Paolo. Now they were like brother and sister-in-law somehow, and they had an affair, and so their punishment, they're stuck in there with the lustful, and the punishment is not only to be blown by a gale force wind for all of eternity, because you couldn't control yourself, so you can't control yourself now. You're literally being blown down all the time. But the cool part of the contrapasso was the fact that because they had had an affair during their lives, they were now merged together as one shade forever and eternity. So it's kind of like, you wanted him, you've got him now forever, and you can't get away from him. Okay, that was incredibly, it's incredibly terrible to think about that, but it was incredibly visual. I mean, he describes that really well. I remember though telling that in a class one time in person, and some girl kind of piped up and she's like, "Oh, that sounds sweet." And I'm like, deadpan, looked her in the eye and said, "Have you ever been married?" And anyway, you definitely don't want to be stuck to someone forever and ever. But anyway, it goes deeper and deeper, and it tells what sins are there. Now, what's interesting is too, you have down there by where is it? Let's see, between the fifth and the sixth circles of hell, you have a little of the ancient mythology coming in with the, sorry, that's my dog, with the river Styx. And you can read on there the criminals and so on. Now, Lucifer at the very bottom in ice is going to have what Dante considers to be the three greatest traitors of all time. Okay? Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Christ, and Brutus and Cassius, who betrayed Julius Caesar. Now, what happens is Lucifer has three heads. You can't see it here in this picture. But each one of the guys, the three worst traitors in Dante's mind, apparently, are being chewed up and eaten constantly by one of Satan's heads for all eternity. Okay, they'd be, I guess, chewed up and eaten and digested and so on. Goes on for all of eternity. Anyway, that's the basics, and so that ends chapter 9. And I need to make sure that I put up the quiz for chapter 8 because I got a message today that I had not done that. Quincy, I'm talking to you. That's my dog again. Please stop. I just want to finish this. Just got 2 words to say. Maybe a couple more. Okay. Anyway, look for the quiz over that, and then you're going to have the exam that covers chapters 7, 8, and 9. So this exam ends here. Everything after this is going to be on the quote final, which is only going to cover chapter 10 and maybe part of 11. All right. See you guys hopefully someday again in person. Bye.